A widow hid a fortune under the mill. Her husband's old partner wanted it and her land too. Rue Ashwood had $11, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a mill maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any old mill work she passed for signs of continued use. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her fed and sheltered for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 9 months earlier, when the regional grain cooperative that employed her consolidated its remaining mill operations into a single modern facility, eliminating every position at the smaller mills the consolidation left behind. She had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The consolidation notice had cited operational streamlining as its justification, language Rue had come to recognize across 9 months of towns exactly like this one as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular mill's specific quirks mattered less than whatever a single centralized facility could theoretically process instead. She had grown up around mill machinery her whole life, her father having maintained grinding equipment for nearly 3 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on his service calls from an early age, to read a mill's condition the way another person might read a familiar face. She found the old grist mill standing beside a slow-moving creek on a cool afternoon in early autumn, its water wheel long since stilled, its stone walls showing the particular soundness of a structure built to outlast whatever business eventually stopped needing it. An elderly woman emerged from a small attached cottage as Rue approached, studying her with a wariness that softened only slightly once she understood Rue meant no harm. "You're not from around here," the woman said. "Name's Beatrice Colby. My husband Samuel ran this mill for over 30 years, until he passed 6 months back. I don't get many visitors, and the ones I have gotten lately haven't exactly improved my opinion of strangers." "I don't mean any trouble," Rue said. "I used to work mill maintenance myself. I saw the wheel from the road and wanted to check its condition. I'm sorry to hear about your husband." "Thank you," Beatrice said. "Come in if you're willing to hear a complicated story along with whatever hospitality I can offer. I could use someone to talk to who isn't already convinced they know exactly what my husband did or didn't do 40 years ago." Over the following hour, Beatrice told Rue, in careful, measured pieces, exactly what had brought a stranger's unwelcome interest to her mill in the months since Samuel's death. Samuel had run the mill in partnership with a man named Thaddeus Grimshaw for the first decade of its operation, decades earlier, before the two men dissolved their partnership amid a bitter dispute over the business's finances. Thaddeus had accused Samuel of hiding profits from their partnership rather than splitting them fairly, an accusation Samuel had always denied, and the two men had parted on terms bitter enough that they hadn't spoken again in the decades since. "Samuel never once raised his voice about it in all the years I knew him," Beatrice said. "He simply said Thaddeus was wrong, and that he didn't intend to spend the rest of his life proving it to a man who'd already made up his mind. I respected that quietness in him. I've come to wonder, these past months, whether it cost him more than either of us understood at the time. Now, 6 months after Samuel's death, Thaddeus's son Elias had arrived at the mill, claiming his father had always believed Samuel hid a considerable fortune somewhere on the property, funds Elias now insisted rightfully belonged to his father's estate, along with a broader claim on the mill's land itself, based on what he called an improperly settled dissolution decades earlier. "Elias has visited 3 times now," Beatrice said, each time more insistent, telling me he intends to pursue a formal legal claim if I don't simply hand over whatever Samuel supposedly hid, along with a considerable portion of this property besides. I don't know what to tell him, because I don't know myself whether Samuel actually hid anything at all, or whether this is simply an old grudge finally finding a target now that Samuel isn't here to defend himself. Did Samuel ever mention anything about the original dispute, or about hiding money from the partnership? Rue asked. Never in any detail, Beatrice said. He said only that Thaddeus's accusation was false, and that he'd rather let the matter rest than relitigate it endlessly with a man who'd already decided what he believed regardless of the truth. I respected that choice while he was alive. I'm considerably less certain it was the right choice, now that his silence has left me facing Elias without any way to properly defend Samuel's own memory. Grief has a way of making a person second-guess even the choices they once fully supported, Rue said. I don't think that means Samuel was wrong to choose peace when he did. I think it simply means you're carrying a weight now that he never expected you to have to carry alone. That's precisely it, Beatrice said. I've spent 6 months defending a silence I never fully understood myself, against a man who's grown increasingly confident that silence proves guilt rather than simply restraint. I don't know how much longer I can keep insisting Samuel was innocent without something more than my own trust in his character to back it up. Then let's see if we can find something more, Rue said. I don't think a man as careful as you're describing would have left nothing behind, if the truth ever actually mattered to him the way you say it did. Rue spent the following days doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She helped Beatrice with the mill's more immediate maintenance needs, and with Beatrice's permission, began a careful search through Samuel's remaining papers and the mill's own structure, looking for anything that might clarify what had actually happened decades earlier. The mill's main grinding mechanism, though unused in the 6 months since Samuel's death, showed signs of neglect Rue addressed over several days, cleaning and relubricating components that had begun seizing from disuse, work that gave her the chance to examine the structure thoroughly enough to notice a section of the foundation wall in the mill's lower level that appeared, on close inspection, to have been rebuilt at some point considerably more recently than the surrounding stonework. She also repaired a worn drive belt connecting the water wheel's shaft to the grinding stones above, and cleared decades of sediment from the mill race that fed the wheel, work that would eventually let the whole mechanism run properly again once the more pressing family matter was resolved. Did Samuel ever do any renovation work down here? Rue asked, running her hand along the subtly different mortar joining that section of wall. Not that I remember him mentioning, Beatrice said, though he did spend considerable time in this lower level, particularly in his final years, more than the mill's actual maintenance needs would have required. I used to tease him about it, ask what exactly kept him down here so long past what any repair should have taken. He always said an old mill deserved a thorough inspector, and left it at that. Working carefully, understanding the historical significance of what she might be disturbing, Rue found a section of the wall that came free with gentle pressure, revealing a hidden cavity behind it, containing a metal strongbox, and tucked beside it, a leather-bound ledger that had clearly been placed there deliberately, rather than simply forgotten. She called Beatrice down to the mill's lower level immediately, understanding this discovery belonged to her rather than to a stranger working alone. Beatrice's hands shook as she reached for the ledger, the particular tremor of someone about to learn something her husband had apparently kept from her their entire marriage. The ledger, written in Samuel's own careful hand, recorded in exhaustive detail the actual financial history of his partnership with Thaddeus Grimshaw, including entries that made both Rue and Beatrice go quiet once they understood their full significance. Samuel's ledger revealed that it had been Thaddeus, not Samuel, who had quietly diverted partnership funds during their final years together, skimming profits into a personal account he'd never disclosed to Samuel until a chance discovery forced a confrontation between them. Rather than pursue a public accusation that would have damaged both their reputations and likely destroyed the mill's business entirely, Samuel had negotiated a private settlement, allowing Thaddeus to dissolve the partnership and depart with his diverted funds intact, in exchange for Thaddeus's agreement to never again claim any interest in the mill or its land. One entry, dated the week of the final settlement, read plainly, "Thaddeus wept when I showed him the evidence, begged me not to ruin him publicly for the sake of his own young family. I have agreed to let him keep what he has already taken, provided he signs away any future claim and never speaks against my own name in this matter. I do this not for his sake, but for the sake of two families who never asked to be dragged into their father's failures. I record the truth here regardless, in case it ever needs telling properly, long after both of us are gone." Thaddeus, it seemed, had subsequently constructed an entirely different account of the split, one in which Samuel was the wrongdoer, a version he had apparently told his own son for decades, rather than admit the truth of what had actually happened. A later entry in Samuel's ledger, added some years after the settlement, noted with quiet resignation, "Heard through a mutual acquaintance that Thaddeus has been telling a different story about our split. I considered correcting the record publicly, then decided against it once more. Some lies cost more to fight than to simply outlast. I hope, if this record is ever found, that whoever reads it understands I chose peace over vindication, not because the truth didn't matter to me, but because two families mattered more." The strong box itself, when Rue and Beatrice finally opened it, contained not the fortune Elias had accused Samuel of hiding, but a modest collection of silver dollars and a handful of savings bonds, funds Samuel had apparently set aside privately during a period of banking instability years after the partnership's dissolution, entirely unrelated to the original dispute, simply a cautious man's private insurance against uncertain times. "This is barely enough to matter to anyone fighting over it," Beatrice said, counting the coins with something between relief and quiet disappointment. Whatever fortune Elias imagined his father was owed, this was never it. This was simply Samuel being careful, the way he was about everything, tucking away what little extra he could manage in case the banks failed again, the way they had once before in his own lifetime. "I don't think the amount was ever really the point for Elias," Rue said. "I think the accusation itself had become the point, somewhere along the way. The actual money was probably always going to disappoint whoever came looking for it. This is exactly what Samuel meant when he said the truth would eventually matter, even if he never got to see it proven himself," Beatrice said, reading through the ledger's careful entries with tears she made no effort to hide. He knew Thaddeus had lied about him for decades. He simply chose not to fight that lie publicly, and left the actual truth here instead, for whoever eventually needed it. Elias Grimshaw arrived at the mill 3 days later, having heard through a mutual acquaintance that Beatrice had found something significant in the mill's lower level, and found Rue standing beside Beatrice at the cottage door, both women considerably more composed than his own confident stride up the gravel path suggested he expected. "Mrs. Colby," Elias said, "I understand you found whatever Samuel was hiding down there. I'll expect that turned over to me immediately, along with a formal discussion about this property's rightful ownership." "I have found something," Beatrice said, "though I don't think it's quite what you were expecting, Mr. Grimshaw. I'd suggest you read this before making any further demands about what you believe you're owed." She handed him Samuel's ledger, and Rue watched Elias's confident expression shift, page by page, into something considerably more uncertain as he worked through decades of careful financial records that directly contradicted everything his own father had apparently told him his whole life. "This can't be accurate," Elias said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. "My father told me Samuel cheated him. He told me that story my entire life. I grew up believing my own family had been wronged by yours." "Your father's own signature is on the settlement agreement recorded in that ledger," Rue said, acknowledging the diverted funds and agreeing to relinquish any further claim on this property in exchange for keeping what he'd already taken. I understand this isn't the story you grew up believing. I don't think that makes the actual record any less true. Why would Samuel keep something like this hidden, rather than simply telling people the truth while he was alive? Elias asked, his anger now tangled with something closer to genuine confusion. Because he understood, better than most, that the truth coming out publicly would have cost your father everything, and cost your own family whatever stability your father managed to build afterward, whatever he'd built it on. Beatrice said, Samuel chose mercy over vindication, Mr. Grimshaw. I don't think that was an easy choice, and I don't think he made it without real cost to his own reputation, which he carried quietly for the rest of his life. Elias sat down heavily on the cottage's porch step, the ledger still in his hands, and was quiet a long while before speaking again. I've spent decades believing my father was wronged, he said. I don't know how to simply set that aside because a book says otherwise. You don't have to set it aside all at once, Beatrice said, her own voice gentler now than the guarded caution she'd carried through his previous visits. I understand this is difficult to hear. I only ask that you accept it as true before pursuing any further claim against land that was never rightfully yours or your father's to begin with. Elias's formal claim, which he had apparently already begun preparing with an attorney before this final visit, was withdrawn within the week, once his own lawyer reviewed Samuel's ledger and confirmed its documentation left no reasonable basis to continue pursuing either the strongbox's contents or any claim on the mill's land. The attorney, a cautious man named Foster Cray, whom Elias had retained on his father's old grievance, called Beatrice directly to confirm the withdrawal, his tone carrying the particular relief of a professional, glad to see a weak claim resolved before it consumed further resources on either side. I'd advised Mr. Grimshaw from the beginning that a decades-old dispute without documentation was a difficult case to build, Cray told her. I don't think either of us expected the documentation to surface quite this decisively or quite this quickly once it did. I owe you both an apology, Elias told Beatrice and Rue in a brief visit some weeks later, considerably more subdued than any of his previous appearances. I spent months pursuing a grievance that was never actually mine to pursue, based on a story I never once thought to question. I'm sorry for the distress I caused you both, chasing something that was never real to begin with. Beatrice used a portion of the recovered savings to fund the mill's proper restoration, work Rue oversaw personally over the following year, understanding the particular satisfaction of returning a structure to full working order after decades of gradual decline. She repaired the water wheel's remaining worn sections, restored the mill race to full flow, and rebuilt the grinding stone's mounting hardware, watching the whole mechanism finally turn again under its own power for the first time in longer than either woman could clearly remember. She stayed on afterward, formally hired as the mill's caretaker, a position that gave her steady work for the first time since her own layoff, and gave Beatrice, in turn, company she hadn't expected to find again at her age. The two women settled into an easy rhythm over that first year, Beatrice sharing stories of Samuel's own careful methods, while Rue restored, piece by piece, the physical structure those methods had once maintained. Elias visited twice more that following year, each time bringing small gestures of the apology he clearly felt he owed but struggled to express fully in words. Firewood one visit, a jar of his own wife's preserves the next, the particular quiet penance of a man rebuilding. Slowly a relationship neither he nor Beatrice had expected to survive his father's decades-old lie. I don't know that my father ever intended the lie to last this long, Elias told Beatrice during his second visit. I think he simply told it once, to protect his own pride in a difficult moment, and then found himself unable to walk it back once it had become the story his whole family believed. I don't excuse it, I simply think I understand it a little better now than I did before." Samuel would have been glad to know the truth finally mattered to somebody besides himself. Beatrice told Rue one evening, watching the newly restored water wheel turn steadily in the creek's current. He carried that lie about himself quietly for decades, rather than fight a battle he thought would only hurt more people than it helped. I don't think he ever expected it to be proven this clearly, this many years after he'd stopped hoping for it. "I think he'd have been glad about more than just the truth," Rue said. "I think he'd have been glad you finally had somebody to share the weight of it with, rather than carrying his own quiet choice entirely alone all these years." Rue wrote to her own father that winter, describing the mill and the ledger and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine shelter search to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the consolidation ended her mill maintenance career. His reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way she remembered him always being. "Told you a good mill hand's habit of checking every wheel she passes would eventually lead somewhere worth staying. Proud of you for finding both the work and the truth that needed finding, right when an old lie was about to cost an innocent woman everything." Rue thought, some evenings that first winter, about the 9 months of towns and consolidation notices that had led her to a still water wheel on a cool autumn afternoon, and understood, watching Beatrice move through the mill's restored lower level, with a peace she hadn't carried in the 6 months since Samuel's death, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own father had modeled decades before she was old enough to understand it fully. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of helping the truth finally reach the people who had waited far too long to hear it. So, here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many quiet men carry an unfair accusation for decades, choosing peace over vindication, and trust that the truth will eventually find its own way to the people who need it? And what does it take? A stranger checking a mill's condition out of habit, a hidden ledger behind a rebuilt wall, an old grudge finally tested against an honest record, for that patient trust to finally be rewarded. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.